in the rolling hills of central Italy, where every sunrise seems painted by the hand of God, a child was born who would one day teach her family what faith truly means. Her name was Sara Matteucci, and from her very first breath, she carried a light that felt older than her years. She came into the world on May 6, 1978, in the quiet town of Urbino, a place where faith was woven into daily life. Her parents, Anis and Angelo, were simple, hard-working people, rooted in prayer, humility, and love. They had no idea that their daughter's short journey would one day move hearts far beyond the valleys of their home. From the moment she could speak, Sara's little words often turned toward heaven. Before sleeping, she would whisper her prayers in the dark, small hands folded tight, her voice soft and certain. When her parents forgot, it was Sara who reminded them. Even at 3 years old, her faith burned brighter than her candles at Mass. Neighbors remembered her as the child with the radiant smile. At Sunday Mass, she sat still and silent, listening as though every word was spoken just for her. Her mother used to say that Sara seemed to love heaven even more than the earth she walked on. There was something unexplainable in her calm, an innocence filled with purpose. Then came the spring of 1983. Sara was 5 years old when her laughter began to fade. She grew pale, then weak. Her stomach swelled, and worry filled her parents' eyes. Doctors at the hospital in Bologna gave the words no parent ever wants to hear: Wilm's tumor, a rare cancer of the kidneys. For her parents, those words felt like a sentence. For Sara, they were simply another invitation to trust. One night, lying in a hospital bed surrounded by cold lights and quiet machines, she looked at her mother and whispered, "Mommy, I'm not afraid. Paradise must be very beautiful." Anis froze, unable to speak. The little girl smiled and turned her gaze to the small wooden crucifix hanging on the wall. Even the nurses noticed her peace. When pain grew stronger, she reached for her rosary, not to ask for escape, but to offer her suffering like a prayer. Her fingers traced the beads until she fell asleep, her lips still moving softly in devotion. While her parents fought to stay hopeful, Sara's faith only deepened. She was the one who consoled them. When her father hid his tears beside her bed, she whispered, "Don't cry, Papa. When I go to heaven, I'll ask Jesus to take care of you." Sometimes she would stare through the hospital window, her eyes following the sunlight that spilled across the floor. She said it made her think of Mary. "She smiles at me, Mom," she said once, but not with her lips, with her heart. When she was finally well enough to return home, Sara walked through her small garden in silence, breathing in the air as though each moment was a prayer. Her illness had changed nothing about her faith. It had only made it shine stronger. That spring, she began to ask questions about the Virgin Mary. Who was she? Did she really see Jesus? Could she hear the prayers of children? Her mother smiled and answered, "The Madonna loves everyone, especially little ones who talk to her." Sara's eyes lit up. "Then I'll talk to her every day." And she did. Every morning before breakfast, she stood by her bedroom window, clutching her small rosary. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it carried something powerful: hope, trust, and love beyond her years. In the quiet streets of Padogliani di Tavuglia, her voice became a melody of faith, the sound of a little girl talking to heaven. No one could have imagined that these simple prayers were preparing her for something extraordinary, something that would take her far from home, to a place where countless people claimed to see the Mother of God. Sara didn't know it yet, but her journey was only beginning. The months that followed were marked by fragile strength. Sara's condition came and went like the tide days of calm, followed by sudden waves of pain. Yet through it all, Her love for the Virgin Mary only grew deeper. Whenever she traveled to Bologna for treatment, she begged her parents to stop first at a small stone chapel nestled in the nearby hills, the Sanctuary of Our Lady of Grace in Montegradolfo. It was only a few minutes from home, but for Sara, it felt like stepping into heaven itself. Inside that quiet church, she would kneel before the statue of the Madonna, her small hands joined tightly together, whispering prayers too soft for anyone else to hear. Her mother would watch her from a few pews back, how still she was, how peaceful. The parish priest began to notice too. Sometimes he'd join her in prayer, kneeling beside the fragile child, whose eyes seemed to glow with something beyond human comprehension. Sara called the Madonna her Madonnina, her little mother. She would tell her everything, her pain, her fears, her small joys, and she always left the sanctuary with a smile. When the treatments became too painful, Sara found comfort in thinking about Mary's life. She wanted to know where the Madonna was born, where she lived, where she prayed. And so, whenever the Matteucci family visited the holy house of Loreto, Sara was overcome with awe. She looked around the ancient stones, the home said to have been carried by angels, and said quietly, "It's so nice to pray here. This is the little house where the Madonnina was born." Her voice trembled with wonder. Her mother held her close, realizing that even in suffering, Sara's heart was being drawn toward something sacred. That summer of 1985 was the hardest one yet. Sara spent most of it in the hospital at Santa Sola, her body weakening under the weight of the illness. The doctors did what they could, but her mother could feel hope slipping through her fingers. In the long, sleepless nights, she prayed for a miracle. There had to be one. She thought God couldn't take away a child so full of love. One morning, as sunlight spilled through the hospital curtains, Anis sat by Sara's bedside and began to talk about the places where the Virgin Mary had appeared throughout history. "Maybe we should go to Lourdes," she suggested gently. "The Madonna appeared there, you know. People have been healed." Sara looked up, her eyes clear and confident, and answered almost immediately, "I don't want to go where the Madonna was. I want to go where she appears now." Her mother froze. Those words, so innocent, yet so certain, echoed like a calling. At the time, all of Italy was talking about the mysterious happenings in a small village of Bosnia and Herzegovina called Medjugorje, a place where 6 young visionaries claimed the Virgin Mary was appearing every day. The church had not confirmed it, and many were skeptical, but thousands of pilgrims were already making the journey. Anis hesitated. Sara's health was fragile, and the road would be long. But her daughter's eyes, so full of life, even as her body failed, made her decision for her. Despite every difficulty, the family prepared for the trip. The doctors warned them, friends pleaded with them to reconsider, but nothing could shake Sara's quiet determination. On September 26, 1985, at just 7 years old, she left for Medjugorje with her mother and father. The journey was exhausting. Her small body could barely handle the hours of travel. Yet she never complained. She clutched her rosary and looked out the window, whispering Hail Marys as the bus climbed through the winding mountain roads. Then something unexpected happened. The bus driver, a tall, quiet man known for mocking the pilgrims, was watching Sara through the mirror. He was an atheist, proud of it, and had taken the job only because it paid well. But something about this frail child caught his attention. When they reached the base of Apparition Hill, he suddenly stood up, walked to Sara's seat, and said, "Let me carry her." Her parents hesitated, but the man gently lifted her into his arms. As he walked up the rocky path, his face began to change. The hardness in his eyes melted into something softer. By the time they reached the top, his silence had turned into quiet tears. When they returned to the bus, The man asked Sara for 2 rosaries, one for each of his daughters. Then, to everyone's surprise, he hung one of them from the rearview mirror of his bus. He didn't say a word, but his face said everything. Sara smiled at him and said simply, "The Madonna loves your daughters too." The rest of the pilgrimage passed like a dream. For Sara, it wasn't about being healed. It was about being close to her Madonna. She prayed with joy, listened to the hymns, and gazed at the statue of Mary with the peace of someone who already belonged to heaven. For her parents, the journey became something else entirely. They had come to ask for a miracle to see their daughter cured. But in those days of prayer, they began to understand what Sara had known all along, that their little girl was a gift, one who didn't belong to them, but to God. When they returned home to Italy, there was no physical healing. The tumor had grown, and her strength was fading. But Sara's spirit was radiant. Something in her eyes had changed. They reflected the quiet certainty of someone who had already seen beyond this world. Her pilgrimage had not saved her body. It had transfigured her soul. After returning from Medjugorje, life at home settled into a rhythm that was both tender and heartbreaking. The illness had taken its toll. Sara could no longer run or play as she once did. But her heart, if anything, seemed larger, brighter. She spoke less about pain and more about heaven, about Jesus, and about the Madonna she had prayed to on that mountain. Her parents still hoped for a miracle, but Sara was focused on something else entirely. She began to talk constantly about Holy Communion. She called it her Jesus sandwich, a phrase that made the nurses laugh and her parents cry. It was the innocence of a child who understood something most adults spend a lifetime searching for: the real presence of love. Every morning, even when pain clouded her face, Sara would ask, "When will I get my Jesus sandwich?" For her, receiving the Eucharist wasn't a ritual. It was an encounter. It was everything. One day, her parents spoke with the local parish priest about her longing to receive communion for the first time. The priest, deeply moved, reached out to the Archbishop of Urbino, Donato Bianchi, explaining Sara's condition and her unshakable faith. The Archbishop didn't hesitate. Permission was granted immediately. And so, in a small hospital room, filled with the hum of medical machines and the scent of flowers, Sara received her first communion. The priest entered with quiet reverence, carrying the ciborium close to his chest. Her parents stood by her bedside, hands trembling. A soft golden light filtered through the curtain, catching in her hair. Sara looked up, her face glowing with anticipation. When the host touched her tongue, she closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, Jesus." Then she smiled a smile that erased the fatigue and the pain for just a moment. To everyone present, it felt as though the entire room had shifted, filled with a stillness that words could not describe. From that day onward, Sara wanted to receive the Eucharist every day. Even when she could barely move, she asked for the priest. Even when the pain was unbearable, she tried to sit up. "I have to get ready," she'd say softly, clutching her small crucifix. "Jesus is coming." Her mother began to notice something strange. The surgical scars that crossed Sara's small belly marks left by the endless operations had begun to form the shape of a cross. It wasn't something anyone planned or even noticed at first. But as the days went by, the cross became clearer, almost deliberate, etched into her skin like a sign of the faith she carried inside. The nurses wept when they saw it. Her parents said nothing, but in their hearts they knew. Even her suffering had been transformed into a prayer. As weeks passed, her health continued to decline, but her peace never left her. She still prayed her rosary every morning, still smiled when someone mentioned the Madonna. Sometimes she'd whisper to her mother, "Mary comes when I pray, not in a dream." but in here. And she'd place her small hand over her heart. Even in the silence of her room, Sara's presence filled the space like light. Visitors who came to console her often left in tears, feeling that somehow she was the one consoling them. Her doctor, a kind but tired man hardened by years of loss, once asked her gently, "Does it hurt, little one?" Sara nodded, then smiled. "Yes, but when I pray, it hurts less. Maybe Jesus is taking a little piece of it each time." Her words lingered long after he left the room. Day by day, Sara grew weaker, yet she never let go of her rosary. Sometimes she couldn't even speak, but her lips still moved along the rhythm of the Hail Mary. And each afternoon, when the priest entered with the Eucharist, she would open her eyes, lift her head slightly, and whisper, "He's here." Her communion became the heartbeat of the household. When she received it, peace seemed to settle over everything: the machines, the whispers, even the fear. It was as though heaven had quietly moved into that small Italian home. In her final weeks, she no longer spoke about being healed. She spoke only of heaven, and of the day she would see Jesus and the Madonna face to face. She told her mother not to be sad. "When I go to heaven," she said softly, "I'll make a garden for you there, with roses and light and no pain." Those words broke her mother's heart and healed it all at once, because by then everyone understood. The miracle they had prayed for had already happened. It was in the peace that filled their home, the faith that replaced fear, and the light in Sara's eyes that refused to go out. The doctors could not explain her serenity, nor the strength that seemed to come from nowhere. But Sara never tried to explain it. She simply smiled, held her rosary close, and whispered one last time, "Jesus sandwich." It was her way of saying that she was ready. Ready for the one she had loved all along. Winter came early that year. The air in Medjugorje grew sharp and still, and the mornings were wrapped in a soft white mist. Inside the Matteucci home, everything was quiet except for the faint ticking of a clock and the sound of prayers whispered under the breath. Sara's little body was failing, but her spirit only shone brighter. Each day was now a fight just to sit up, yet she insisted on dressing neatly, brushing her hair, and waiting for the priest to arrive. Receiving the Eucharist had become the center of her world. It was no longer a habit, it was a meeting. When pain gripped her, she didn't complain. Instead, she'd close her eyes and whisper, "It's okay, Jesus is near." Sometimes she would hold her rosary tight and repeat, "Hail Mary, full of grace," until her breathing calmed again. Her parents tried to be strong, but every sound, every pause in her breathing tore at their hearts. They took turns sitting beside her bed at night, afraid to sleep, afraid that a moment's rest might mean missing her final words. One cold evening, her mother entered the room to find Sara awake, her eyes wide and glistening. She was looking upward, her lips trembling in awe. "What is it, my love?" Anis whispered. Sara smiled weakly. "The light," she said. "It's so beautiful." Anis followed her daughter's gaze, but saw only the pale ceiling and the flicker of a candle's flame. Tears welled up, but Sara squeezed her hand gently and whispered, "Don't cry. The Madonna is here. She says not to be afraid." That night, something shifted in the house. There was a peace that no one could explain, a stillness that felt holy. Days passed, each one slower than the last. Sara could no longer eat or speak much, but her eyes were alive, filled with a depth that belonged to another world. When visitors came, she greeted them with a soft smile and a few quiet words of gratitude. Her last wish was simple: to receive communion one final time. The morning of January 27, 1986, The sky was heavy with snow. Outside, flakes began to drift lazily through the air, covering the ground in silence. Inside the Matteucci home, the priest arrived, carrying the Eucharist wrapped in a small white cloth. Sara was barely conscious, her breathing shallow, but when she saw him, her eyes opened wide. A faint smile appeared on her lips. The priest leaned close and whispered, "Sara, this is Jesus." She tried to lift her head, but her strength was gone. Her mother supported her, tears falling onto the blanket. The priest placed a tiny fragment of the host on her tongue. For a moment, everything stopped. Sara's lips moved faintly. "Thank you, Jesus." Those were her last words. Moments later, she took a shallow breath, folded her hands around her rosary, and looked toward the ceiling one last time, as if seeing someone she knew was waiting for her. Then, with a soft exhale, she was gone. Outside, the snowfall thickened, blanketing the village in white. The flakes were large, slow, and almost luminous, as if heaven itself was marking the moment of her homecoming. Her mother sat beside her, holding her daughter's lifeless hand, whispering through her tears, "You found your Madonnina, my love." And in that stillness, she understood what her daughter had always known, that heaven is not far away. It begins where love is pure, where faith is complete, and where a child can look into suffering and still say, "It's okay, Jesus is near." The parish bells rang that evening, slow and mournful, echoing through the snowy hills. Neighbors came quietly to the door with candles and prayers. They spoke in hushed voices about the little girl who never complained, who prayed more than she cried, who loved the Madonna as her own mother. At her funeral, the church overflowed. The air was heavy with incense and tears. The choir sang Ave Maria as the small white coffin was carried down the aisle. Yet the sorrow was touched by something radiant, an awareness that this was not an ending, but a beginning. A family friend said later, "When she died, it didn't feel like a death. It felt like light leaving one room to enter another." In the weeks that followed, stories began to spread. Nurses spoke of the peace that lingered in her hospital room long after she left. The parish priest said he had never seen faith so pure, and her mother, though heartbroken, found herself praying with new strength. Sara's short life had left a mark on everyone who knew her, a reminder that holiness is not about grand miracles, but about quiet surrender. That sometimes the greatest miracle is the peace that appears when there should be none. And on that cold January evening, as snow continued to fall over Urbino, the heavens seemed to whisper her name, Sara Matteucci, the child who loved heaven more than herself. The snow that fell on the day of Sara's passing did not melt quickly. For days, it blanketed the hills of Tavolia, covering everything in silence. The world seemed to pause, as though heaven had drawn near to comfort the earth that had lost one of its purest souls. Inside the Matteucci home, her mother kept her small rosary by the window, the one Sara had prayed with every morning. It still smelled faintly of the perfume that filled her room during her final hours, a scent no one could explain. Anis would sit quietly and whisper the same prayers her daughter once said, imagining her voice still echoing through the walls. But grief has a strange way of revealing grace. Though her parents' hearts were heavy, their house soon became a place of pilgrimage. Friends, neighbors, even nurses from the hospital began to visit. They didn't come out of curiosity, but to feel what they couldn't describe, a peace that seemed to linger, soft but unmistakable. Some would leave with tears in their eyes, saying they felt closer to God than they had in years. Sara's story began to spread, first by word of mouth, then in newspapers and church bulletins. People were moved not by miracles of healing, but by something far greater, the miracle of faith in its purest form. One of the priests who had known her said, "She taught us that holiness doesn't wait for age. God sometimes hides his saints in children." Years passed, but her light refused to fade. Her family would receive letters from people all over Italy, thanking them for sharing Sara's story, letters from mothers praying for sick children, from doctors who said her courage had changed how they viewed their work, and from pilgrims who said that after hearing her story, they found their way back to prayer. Then came the book. Journalist Roberto Mazzoli, who had gathered testimonies from her parents, doctors, and priests, published Sara Matteucci, The Mystery of a Child's Faith. It was not a grand biography, but a gentle mosaic of memories, each one carrying the quiet power of truth. Through its pages, readers encountered the innocence that had moved mountains, the love that made even suffering shine with beauty. Soon after, a small charity was founded in her name to support sick children and missionary work abroad. One of its projects helped build homes and a chapel for orphaned children in Argentina. On the wall above the altar, a plaque bears her name, "In memory of little Sara, who lived for love." Those who visit say the chapel carries the same peace that once filled her hospital room. In her hometown, the church where she once attended Mass holds a small painting of her smiling, a rosary in her hands. Children stop and look at it before catechism class. Some draw hearts on scraps of paper and leave them at the base of the frame. For them, Sara isn't a distant story. She's a friend. Someone small and real, who reminds them that heaven listens even to the simplest prayers. Her mother, Anis, would later say that losing Sara broke her heart, but also saved her soul. "I used to pray for her healing," she once confessed. "But now I see that she was the healing. God sent her to teach us how to love, how to trust, how to let go." It is said that faith can move mountains. Sara's faith moved something even greater, the human heart. She showed that holiness isn't in the grand gestures of saints carved in marble, but in the quiet strength of a little girl who, even in pain, could say, "Jesus is near." Even today, nearly 40 years later, people still whisper her name in prayer. In hospital corridors, in the pews of small Italian churches, in families who know the weight of suffering. Her story continues to travel from voice to voice, like a candle passed from one trembling hand to another, its flame never diminishing. Perhaps that is her miracle. Not a body healed, but 1,000 hearts rekindled. Not a sign written in the sky, but a lesson etched gently into time. That true faith isn't about escaping suffering, but transforming it into love. When you walk through the hills of Urbino today, you can still hear the church bells she once listened to. And if you pause long enough, you might feel what her parents once felt, that heaven was never far away. Because somewhere beyond the clouds, beyond pain and time, there is a little girl smiling with the same gentle light she carried on earth. Her hands are folded, her voice is soft, and if you listen closely, you can almost hear her whisper the words she once said with all her heart: "Jesus is near." Sara Matteucci, pray for us.